Welcome to Pod Almighty, your monthly podcasting masterclass. This show is all about putting our radio and broadcasting experience to good use to help you achieve your podcast aims. I'm James Marriott. I worked full-time in radio for the best part of 2 decades, and now I help other businesses and individuals to create, launch, grow, and develop a successful podcast of their own through my business, Sound Media.
And I'm Ellie Codling, former radio producer, music scheduler and programming coordinator, and I'm now working as a podcast producer and editor with many clients around the UK, helping them launch their podcasts and support and manage and edit them along the way.
We want to put our experience and, more importantly, our contact books to good use to help other podcasters. So today we are talking all things graphic design with George Lodwick, who's the founder of Lodwick Designs and works with a variety of podcasters. George, thank you for joining us. My first question to you is a fairly wide one. Does graphic design actually matter when it comes to podcasting? I mean, it's audio, isn't it? Surely graphic design doesn't matter at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's as you know, James, it's the most common question I get asked. And the easiest analogy that I normally go with when answering that is it's not, although it's audio, it's not too dissimilar from a movie. You know, if someone releases a movie, you don't just plaster the cover all over the place. You know, bringing the inside of the podcast out of it into content and into marketing tools is super important.
Yeah, totally agree with you. The way that I always look upon it is that you can think about your podcast as a podcast, or you can think about your podcast as one part or the first part of what ultimately becomes a brand. And that's what you really want, isn't it? We all want our podcast to be successful, and successful when it comes to podcasting means that it ultimately is more than just a podcast that people listen to once a week or once a month, and therefore the visual elements to it are just equally important. And I think I've made the mistake when I first started podcasting of probably not really recognizing that importance, and perhaps thinking just kind of doing it myself or getting a mate to throw something together in MS Paint or something will do the job, and it sort of does, but then you're always stuck at kind of a certain level, aren't you? And so that visual element is a huge part of what pushes you on. We are drawn to the way things look generally, aren't we? So if we bearing in mind the fact that for a lot of us, the first experience that we'll have of finding a podcast that we like is probably through something like social media. So it is visual, the first experience we have of a podcast.
Agreed. I mean, like you say, the thing is with it is it's always a podcast, like you said, is audio, right? So just generally the idea of what it looks like visually is just always seems like it seems appropriate to put it on the back burner, but really I think it is just as important as the content of the podcast in terms of getting people just to press the play button.
Yeah, because it's the first thing you see, isn't it? If you're going to look for a podcast, before you've heard it, you've seen it. So it's got to stand out. What would you say are the key features on that artwork to really draw a listener in?
I mean, it depends on the vehicle of your podcast. I would say, you know, if you're coming from a place where you want your podcast to resonate with people that are already in your industry. So, you know, for example, you had a recruitment podcast or, you know, a radio podcast. The best idea for that would to be get the cover looking as attractive as you can for that audience. Whereas if you're doing it for yourself you're known as yourself is your brand, then it's really important to get your face on there. It's just important to really get across the actual meaning of the vehicle, basically. So, you know, you want to attract people for the content, or you want to attract people for your personal brand, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think what I kind of take from that a little bit, George, is actually how this just plays into a much wider strategy, and understanding why you're podcasting and understanding what you're kind of working towards, and therefore the level of help that you need with something like graphic design really starts to become clear when you sort of understand where you're at and where you're working towards. And for me, and Ellie, I guess you're kind of the same, the majority of people that we work with are podcasting for their business, and whether it's directly for their business or whether it's just kind of like a side project that's just designed to increase their profile that ultimately is going to help them when it comes to business, it all comes back to the same point. And therefore you would not launch a business without having, at very least, a little bit of, a logo and some idea of your visual identity and kind of fonts and things like that. Or if you do, you're probably not going to do very, very well. And it's the same when, you bring a podcast into that equation. It's just dead important to kind of have that and do that. What kind of clients do you generally find yourself working with, George?
So it's a lot of quite serious podcasts, to be honest, in terms of the content. So they'll all be kind of in recruitment or in tech. There's not a lot, which is a shame, of a lot of kind of passion projects that I deal with, which I'd like to take a bit more on. But I'm more kind of, my expertise is kind of podcast coming from the inside of a business.
Yeah, so like you say, George, it's like what you were saying, James, it all comes down to the strategy at the start, doesn't it? You need to always be thinking about who your listener is, who you're targeting, and that comes down to the artwork as well, your brand, getting your message across. And so what's your thoughts on Canva? Would that be a good place to start?
I mean, I actually did a video about this last week, but yes and no. Canva is excellent for small tasks once you've already got a base of your branding.
Yeah.
But really, a brand is about so much more than shapes and colors, right? There's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes in my role that you just can't do on a free to design platform. There's lots of things around, color feelings, fonts, spacing, iconography. You're kind of freestyling on Canva. So it is a good tool for, once you've got all that sorted beforehand, you can create whatever you want on that platform. Great. But I think when it comes to branding it at the grassroots, I don't think it's the best option, for sure.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
I'd echo that as well, in that I am a Canva user, and I'm quite upfront and honest about that. And George, you've done a lot of design work for me, which has been brilliant. And I found, I hope, a really happy medium now, whereby I have kind of the bespoke stuff that you design, and then it's quite easy for me to tweak things just as I need them for kind of certain posts for social media and stuff like that. And that seems to be a really clever way of sort of using something like Canva, because for a lot of people it's just not achievable to have a full-time graphic designer that you think, I want to do a new image to go with my podcast episode this week. Well, I can't afford to pay someone every week to do that. But kind of that initial setup of kind of, creating a template that I can reuse, and then every so often I will come back to you and say, actually, it needs a bit of a refresh now. Can we do this? Can we do the other? Suddenly it becomes kind of a cost-effective thing. So in my mind, I wonder if something like Canva is actually kind of positive in the general scheme of graphic design, because it does open up something that once upon a time I would have thought I'll never be able to afford to go deep into something like graphic design. It was off limits to people for a while, and now suddenly kind of using this combination of a designer and Canva kind of means that it's a little bit more accessible, which is brilliant. There is a downside to it, and I'm sure you'll echo this, George, and probably you as well, Ellie. I sometimes see people's podcasts and I see their cover art, and straight away I'll go, that's a template from Canva. You can spot it a mile off, and it's just one of the first that they come to, where they just kind of scroll through and think, oh, that's all right, I'll take that, and do very little to change it. Sometimes even it's still got kind of like Canva watermarks on some of the stuff with it, and that for me is where it does become a negative, because that kind of screams to me like you just don't care enough to actually take a little bit of time to make something that is personalized to you. And actually this brings us back to the same point, doesn't it? There's always going to be a point whereby you need someone that really knows what they're doing to be able to create that really important top level, top folder stuff like your cover art.
Just to add to that quickly, James, there's also another aspect of kind of again, I'm a big advocate of Canva for saving your business money, as I've said before, but there's one other downside, is that when somebody is doing something themselves, there's a very fine line between what you think looks good and what everyone else thinks looks good. And a lot of people will make something on Canva, think that looks great, get no feedback on it at all, or no external expertise, and just post it. So it can be a very, you're only limited to your laptop screen, and it can be a very one-sided kind of process.
Yeah,
and it's apparent, and that's where you get like you said, James, it's quite obvious when that comes into play, I think, from an outsider, when you see that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you make there as well, George, in that crosses over in podcasting in general, I think, in that every element that you do, it's good to get the feedback. You should always be getting your feedback from your listeners. Listen back to your own podcast yourself. Take another listen. Some people don't even edit theirs, but the edit process can be quite cathartic in finding out more. And it's the same, isn't it? This at the point you're talking about, that who's not even heard your podcast yet, but you need someone's view and opinion before they've even heard your content of what is this about? What does this piece of artwork say to you of what this is going to sound like? And feedback is crucial in every stage of podcasting, even at this point.
For sure.
Yeah. I one thing that always kind of jumps out at me is that I don't think that, like, I'm going to just refer to us now as just like, everyday people. By that I mean people who aren't graphic designers. I'm not sure that we normally see the value in stuff like leaving space on a design. And certainly when I've done stuff before, my temptation is to just try and fill every little bit of space on a design, because I never think about actually leaving some space there is ultimately going to make it look better. And yet I'll then see a design that someone like George does for me, and I'm like, oh wow, that looks brilliant. But actually a lot of it, there's nothing there, and they're the sort of elements that we don't really understand when we don't have that kind of graphic design experience and background. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because I look at it in kind of maybe an extreme way. I'll walk through life finding a poster and saying, do you know what, that could be maybe like 3 millimeters to the left. So it's difficult. There's two things, but it is for sure. It's a fair point, I think.
I think it's a fair point, James, because I'm no graphic designer. I'm that person that you're talking to, the everyday person, and I wouldn't think of the use of space in that way. So definitely bringing someone on board like George is going to be an asset to what you're trying to launch as your podcast. So what's your thoughts then, George? Sometimes you see on podcasts, you've got your show artwork, and then some people always like to create a new piece of artwork per episode. What do you see the advantages in that? Or no advantage?
Talking about kind of the main cover artwork.
Every episode, some people like to create a new piece of artwork for every episode. Do you think, why would you do that? Is there a bonus to doing that?
Yeah,
Pros?
yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think that, like what I was saying earlier, it's kind of, you only really know what's inside that podcast until you press the play button, if all you've got is just the cover. So I think, why wouldn't you? It's like just tagging it onto what you said on Canva. If you've got your branding already on there, you're already paying your subscription to make it. Why would you not produce extra content to drag people into that episode? So a lot of people will kind of introduce the guest, or take a quote from the podcast, and the more content, the better. I think, really. Obviously, there's a top end limit, but to try and produce just things to drag people in is just always going to be beneficial, I feel.
Yeah.
I think certainly from a podcasting perspective as well, I think we're seeing things change a little bit now, whereby the ability to upload an episode-specific cover art image is something that's been knocking around for a little while. And for a long time, I kind of thought, why would anyone do this? Because you don't really see it anywhere, maybe on your own website for your podcast. But then Spotify adopted that. So now you'll come across podcasts in Spotify where every episode has a different image. And there's a real kind of extreme on this. There's a real plus side to it, and there's a real downside to it. So I'll sometimes see whereby they'll upload, say, a picture of the guest as the image for that episode, and therefore you look down the list of episodes, and every one of them's got a completely different image next to it. And that looks unusual to me, because I'm used to podcasts generally, when you've got a list of episodes, it will always be that same cover art image. The plus side to it, obviously, is that you are able to perhaps have a sort of a template whereby you can maintain like the same background and elements of the same wording, but perhaps drop in a different photograph of a different guest for each episode. So what would your thoughts be on that, George? Because my immediate thought is that actually you can go too far in terms of changing cover art episode completely for every different episode, but having the basis of, and it takes us back to what we said at the beginning, isn't it? It's having the basis of an actual thought out design package that you're able to just adjust and tweak for these things.
I mean, it goes back to the importance of branding itself. This can work, I think, changing the cover every episode, but your branding's got to be strong enough to punch through that. The person on the front shouldn't be a thought of, is this the same podcast as the last one? The branding should be so strong that it's anything you put on that cover artwork, it's apparent that it's attached to what you've already got.
Okay, and another question that I wanted to ask you, which I find really fascinating. So let's imagine that you're creating a podcast for someone. You're creating the cover art image, for someone, and maybe it's a little bit of a passion project, but they're approaching it with like a real element of professionalism to it. But they don't have existing branding. They don't have kind of like a logo and stuff like that. How does the process work when you kind of start with literally you've got a blank computer screen in front of you? How do you start making decisions about what elements to include and how to start putting together something for someone when they don't already have kind of a brand guidelines in place? How does that process work?
So the most important thing for me in that process, and it sounds a bit of a cop-out, but kind of inspiration. Most people, if they want to start a podcast, are going to be inspired by podcasts that they've already listened to, or they've already seen. So taking it back to what inspired them to start it in the first place, what they've listened to, or in my case, what they've seen before, is a big starter. And then it's just about pulling, like you say, about that level of passion project and professional together in somewhere on the scale that they're comfortable with and somewhere that relates to them. So, and then obviously simple things of just like, what's the message of the podcast, the color scheme and the style of font, etc. is going to be based around that. You have a podcast that's based around you and your mates talking, then we're probably going to have some crazy font on there. But if you're talking about, business development or something similar than that, then we'll base something a bit more appropriate to that.
Well, and so you often see, well, like we were just saying, people put the guest photos on and they change each episode so you can see the person that's guest. What about creating your own photos for your artwork? Do you think it's worth having your own stock images, or again refer to Canva? What's the benefits, if there are any?
In terms of
your own stock images, having some stock images of that you've taken for yourself. Is it worth paying a photographer and getting some quality photos done? Yeah,
I mean, it just comes down to the better the camera. It sounds stupid, but the better the camera, the better the photo, really. And obviously, you want as high quality assets on any piece of design as you can, really, because something that's fuzzy is just going to not hit the same. So it's quite a fairly simplified answer, but yeah. Most definitely it's always worth paying for the highest quality visual pieces you can in terms of photography.
Yeah.
What I'm finding quite interesting is that we're talking about a few different subjects, and yet we seem to come back to the same point on quite a lot of them. So that is, what do you want someone to think? What do you want someone to feel when they see your your artwork for the first time. If it's a bit of a grainy photograph, or it's a bit washed out, and it's quite obvious that someone has taken it themselves on perhaps a phone camera from a few years ago that's not brilliant, we're human beings, and we kind of make a judgment, don't we, at that point? We can't really help it. You'll make a judgment about a brand or a person or a business based on that stuff that you see from the outset. And that's really important, I think, particularly when you think about stuff like logos, branding, websites, all this stuff. You very quickly make a decision, don't you, about what kind of business something is on the basis of what you see about it. So that brings us back to the point that we were talking about earlier, really, which is whereabouts do you want to see yourself within the podcast marketplace? Because you can do it yourself on Canva, and for a lot of podcasters, less and less so, I would say. I would kind of say they probably don't really need to do any of this stuff. If it's just something they're doing for a laugh, for a bit of a passion project, that's just for a bit of fun, and they don't really want to spend any money on it, but they also don't really care what kind of audience they get, then I probably wouldn't say, you need to invest some money into design, because you probably don't. But then you'll also get bored after 6 months and you'll pack it in. So the people that really want to make a good go of this, and that are really looking to make an impact, you wouldn't just have a go at designing your own website, although that's probably something I've had a go at that. We've probably all had a go at that at some point or other. And you quickly realise I need to get someone that actually knows what they're doing to do this. What about, I mentioned there about a logo. So in my experience, something like getting a logo design tends to be a bit more expensive than just asking someone to kind of, knock up an image from existing things. Do you think something like a podcast, and this is a question to both of you, something like a podcast needs a logo as such, or is it just about picking an appropriate font?
I think the actual medium of a podcast artwork is actually kind of too small to be thinking about using a logo as your main piece of branding. Most of the time you're only acting on an iPhone screen or something small. So I think it's probably it's a lot more valuable to go with some solid branding in terms of colors and imagery rather than a logo, because unless you want that logo as the cover art, it's not going to serve as much purpose sitting in the corner in terms of monetary value. You've put 3/4 of your budget into having the logo made that sits in the top right hand corner, and the rest of it you've had to skimp and make yourself. I don't think it's not as valuable within this specific industry, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true as well. And like you say, James, you and I mainly work with businesses anyway, and their podcasts are used as a marketing tool for their business. So why you would, in that instance, you would make sure your logo is well seen on your podcast artwork. But if you're starting out, blank canvas, who's my audience, the avatar, everything, and down to that, then I think George is right. Your colours and that style of brand is probably more relevant than the actual logo. But if you're a business, don't forget your logo on that artwork.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of fine to maybe start a podcast without something like a logo, and just kind of I always say to people, it doesn't really matter how much planning and preparation you put into it. You'll definitely find after 6 months that there are things that you've changed about how you approach your podcast. There's stuff that you learn along the way, and you learn actually maybe a bit more about who the audience is, and that means you slightly tweak the content of it. And it's the same when it comes to the actual visual appearance of your podcast. You might have an idea before you start about what you want it to look like, but after 6 months you'll really know, you'll understand, because you'll kind of, this thing will have got wheels, and it'll be it'll be running. You'll find out actually stuff about your podcast that you didn't really know about before you started. And that's the point there where you go, all right, now we can start turning this into a brand, and it can have a logo, and that does mean that we can do stuff like really branding up our social media pages, and it's really worth doing it at that point, because you really know what your podcast is. And that's really, really interesting. George, you said something in there that I want to go back to, and that is something that I think so many people overlook. And this is very specific about when we're talking about podcast cover art. And so there is stuff about podcast cover art that I still find a lot of podcasters probably don't know before they really start, which is it's got to be within certain dimensions. It's got to be within a certain file size for Apple to be happy with it. And those two don't necessarily always go hand in hand. So it's got to be a minimum of 1400 pixels squared and a maximum of 3000 pixels squared. But it's also got to fit within a certain size range, which sometimes does mean that you're kind of back and forth with your designer, kind of getting them to nudge down the size of the file a little bit. It's got to be in the RGB color space, which I think most design work probably is nowadays, but that's just something worth bearing in mind, because if it's not, I can't remember the name of the other color space. You'll know it, George, off the top of your head, but
probably, the CMYK or something.
That's the one. You'll find that your podcast just gets rejected by different podcasters. So it's really important to know that. But and this is the bit where it doesn't come down to set rules, but podcast cover art, I always describe this to clients as, if you imagine at its smallest when you're playing a podcast on your phone and it's displaying the cover art kind of like really small resolution, it's about the size of a sugar cube. That's what you've got to work with. So if you've got really intricate wording on there that looks brilliant when it's on a full-size screen, that's fabulous. But people aren't going to see that when they're actually looking at it in probably the most likely resolution that they are to see it. So I always say to people, look, a general mantra, less is more when it comes to cover art. Keep it simple and try and have as little wording on there as you can do, so that what you do include can be as big as possible, so that you can actually see it. Certainly the important stuff, you need to be able to see it when it's at really small resolution. What other kind of things do you kind of see as being kind of important kind of style pointers when it comes specifically to cover art, George?
Yeah, so I always tend to edge people to go towards one, really short names is quite important. 3-4 word names. Just so you said, James, you can just get that real big and bold on there. I usually try and go for one kind of piece of iconography that kind of represents the theme of the podcast. So you might have a football behind somewhere on there. It doesn't have to be the main image on there, but something subtle that can obviously fill out that space just to give immediate context to what the podcast is on. And then as well, just with the color things, you don't want to have 60 different colors on there, because it just becomes a blur when it's the size of a sugar cube. So you want to go with just, it's just big, like you said, big, bold, short as possible with the title, real bold iconography on there. You just want to make it pop in the smallest space you've got, really.
Brill, that's good. Ellie, any other questions that you wanted to ask?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm coming at this I am that person that doesn't know a lot about graphic design, or design, and this conversation's really useful. I mean, we know, like James has said, he advises his podcasters don't do anything too complicated, because majority of people are looking at it as a thumbnail, and that's the same advice I give. But and title length as well. That's a whole new discussion, isn't it? How to brainstorm your title length to make that part of your avatar, to get your listener. Who is your listener? The same with your art. Your title needs to be the same as to tell them this is going to be for me. So, but bearing in mind what you're saying, George, no more than 4 words. Set yourself another challenge, but
yeah, it's difficult for sure.
Yeah.
Some really interesting points there. George, if there's anyone that's kind of listened to this, be it someone that's thinking about getting into podcasting, or someone that's an existing podcaster who's now thinking, God, I've really neglected this and I've approached it all wrong, what's your kind of advice for the next best step for someone that's now panicking, thinking, I need some help when it comes to my graphic design?
Okay, so kind of, again, going back to the size of it, if you've already got a podcast artwork and you haven't bothered to do anything more than that, you're okay. All you've got to change is a podcast artwork, essentially. So these things can be changed quite easily. And again, just to reiterate, moving forward, I just think you need to be thinking about the max amount of content you can to attract people to that episode. It's just really important, I think. Introduce your guests properly, give context on where they're from and what the episode's going to be covering. Give some kind of standout quote from the episode that's going to get people thinking. It's just the same. I always picture it as you could have a room full of treasure, but if the door looks rubbish, you're not going to open it.
That's a brilliant note for us to close on. That's brilliant. Thank you, George. Thank you for your thoughts and really interesting stuff in there, and hopefully lots for people to think about. If there's a subject that you would like us to cover, or maybe a guest that we should talk to on a future episode, then please let us know and join us every month as we explore the big wide world of podcasting. If you want to find out more about us, head to wearesoundmedia.com, and we will see you soon on Pod Almighty.